Looks like plaid is the
It's my
pattern of the day. Yeah.
cat cheese outfit. Ooh, sorry. Okay.
All right.
Right. And who is driving today?
I can drive. I have the document and I can script check.
Okay, great.
So I think the main, I did send out a little bit of information prior to the meeting. I sent out the draft of this document. So I'm going to screen share, which means I won't see if anyone ends up in the lobby. So if somebody else could manage that for me, that would be great.
I got you.
Thank you, sir. All right. So just to review, this is our January 15th report to the Senate and House. So there were a few, so I sent out the broad document and we can come back to like feedback on other areas that I didn't flag as specific discussion points for today, if people have that. But what I wanted to do was dive into a couple of things under general requirements. And you know what, I'm just going to show the outline for just a second to refresh everybody on what we're doing. So the first chunk of this is requirements for automated systems. And we had some good discussion last time on the requirements for final decision systems that if it was an AI system that was actually taking an action, the impacts needed to be transient and reversible, and any actions taken needed to be constrained by legality. And we had some examples. If the decisions didn't meet these criteria, they could be a support decision system. In any case, no matter what type of AI system it was, we had a couple of requirements around auditability. I wanted to fill in some more of those requirements today. And I'll let Joe in unless you got it, Mark.
Nope, got it.
Okay, thank you.
Josiah?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you sending it out. I have several small comments. Are we doing that today live, or do you want me to send them to you?
We'll do it today live a little bit later.
Okay.
Let me get through the rest of the structure, and then maybe we'll have a couple of the discussion topics and then dive in to those. Okay, so those are the systems I grabbed because it fits really well in this framework. Some of the content that I worked on at the beginning of the year around how to handle systems that were not in compliance. So it might be upstream, it might be downstream, it might be changing the AI system itself. We can take that out if you want. It was included in the inventory report, but I think it's evolved a little bit since then. So I wanted to at least have the option of including it here. Then we had said we wanted to come back to procurement standards, so I wanted to talk about those today. We last time talked about notice of AI usage, and I have some notes to flesh out on that still, but I think we have that pretty well roughed in. Explainability, similar. I think we discussed this pretty well last time. We put a flag in workforce development, so I added a section for that. And then down at the bottom, I included our generative AI policy, which I did release on our website earlier this week. And several other states have already reached out and said that they appreciate that and will be using that as a model for their work. So that's included in here because I think that's important to highlight to legislature. And then the discussion we had on automated translations. So that's what I believe is going to be included in the report. If there are other things that should be included, we can add those, but I think that's the rough outline. Any questions on the outline or things that are like, we should definitely make sure we cover this in our report for this year? Okay. If anything comes up, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, and we can we can add them and then discuss in the council. Because of the requirements of open meeting law, we need to make sure that we are doing any meaningful work in the context of this body and in public forum, but you can send comments and stuff to me outside and we can kind of read them into the record during one of these sessions if needed. All right, I'm going to jump back up here to the general requirements. So Mark, I wanted to put you on the spot first, or anyone else, I guess, who was on the committee that researched AI prior to the council being created. One of the things we're supposed to talk about in this report is whether the technologies are operated continuously or used only under specific circumstances. On the face of it, like, it's being used under specific circumstances because they're being applied to specific like clumps of data, at least in most of the use cases we're talking about. But I wanted to get a little bit more on if anyone had background, if there was intent beyond that in this point. So Mark, if you have anything, that'd be great, or if anyone else
Yeah,
does.
so there were, I think it was really kind of trying to get a sense of whether it was going to be kind of batch operated or part of a normal, just regular workflow, right? I think that's kind of the way we were looking at it, right? Are you, as a developer or a data scientist or a decision maker, like basically turning on the AI system, or is it running in the background doing things like looking at calls coming in the Chittenden County area and determining that, hey, there might be some public disturbance or something going on. I don't know. We were looking at those kinds of things.
Okay, that's helpful. So previously we've talked about in general, systems that kind of learn in real time are things that we in general probably are not looking for. We want systems that go through like a release process and that there's some reasonable level of review and testing prior to new versions coming out. So
Well, can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
that? I mean, there are systems, I mean, Chat GPT is a great example, or, and by the way, I don't think we should use the language of LLMs. That's a specific technology. I think we should talk about generative AI and replace every instance of LLM. That's the technology of the day, but there are many other generative techniques. But systems like that continuously learn. So
they are
very much.
They do release seasonal models, at least of ChatGPT. I don't know about the others, but they're monthly releases.
The underlying model
Right.
is updated, but when you're interacting with it, the context it builds around, for example, your questions, is retained, right?
That's a good point. Yep.
Yeah. So in other words, the model extension, that's human mediated, reinforcement kind of, I think that's what they call it. But so it is continuously learning in that.
It is until it gets to a point of signal to noise ratio in some fashion, and then they release another, like they go from Chat GPT 3 to GPT 4. Right. So
Right.
it's you could look at it more like it's major versus minor releases, right? Like the retention is really in the minor release pattern, but the major release pattern really kind of starts, with a validated base point of knowledge and then begins to learn again.
Right. But how do we, I thought the language was a little black and white, where you just announced, you just correctly pointed out that there's a kind of a gray.
That's a good point. I guess what I was trying to get at with this was we don't want systems that are kind of dynamically changing their underlying model for the most part. There may be cases where that's appropriate, but at this point, we kind of want systems that are a little bit more boring in that they're trained to do a task, and then they do that task until we train them again to do the task better. Is that? No.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't know how to wordsmith that. Let's think about that. Would you be able to say something that, that, let's see, where's the actual wording? I don't know. Let's come back to that.
I haven't done actual wording on this yet. This is
Okay.
just structured.
I would say any tool that's based on a base model set would have those attributes, that we would need it to be human checked, et cetera, based on those. So I would say, I would specifically say that technology, the base model, maybe saying the
Right.
base,
Right.
Okay.
I don't know. You understand the point? It's kind of,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a good clarification, and what I had was not clear. So thank you. Fix that. Okay. I can work on words for that. This concept of like batch operations are part of a regular workflow. As I'm thinking about this guidance, it's really focused on like would there be a difference between those two, right? We only need to really address that if we would treat batch operated or regular workflow systems differently. So I guess, are there thoughts about, if something is being run kind of on a bunch of data all at once and getting some sort of output versus like I'm using this thing every day, each piece that flows through it has an AI operation. Would we expect to treat those kinds of systems differently?
I think at some level, yes, because you have to consider the life cycle implications, right? If you're running something that's you say you've got a bunch of year-end data analysis that you need to run for budgeting, right, for the year's budget, and you do it in that batch fashion, you're going to more or less just, you're going to confirm that tool is still up to the job the next time you have to run that batch process, right? Or you'll pick a tool, you'll update it, you'll be reviewing it, you'll have those review points built into the life cycle, right? I think the difference is if something's running continuous, where do you inject those review points, right? Like, is it still doing its job? Is it still complying with all of our requirements?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I should raise my hand. I was going to say that the language there I thought was good about, but do we need to talk about what the test of that would be? I mean, for example, in most AI systems, you have a test set, and when a new model would come out, you would present it with the same stuff, then you would review the output to ascertain whether it was still doing the right thing. How do we expect to determine that, and what test data? I mean, it varies by the application, but would we need to talk about, the tests that we would run to determine whether the next release did the appropriate thing?
I think that's part of it, right? I think there also needs to be just sort of, when I say review, I also think of bringing it back to a group who is thinking about things bigger than just data accuracy, right? Is this causing harm in some way now? Is it fulfilling the mission, right? So I don't know that you can build automated tests for some of those things, right?
Yeah.
So
And
that's why I was calling it kind of a review, point.
I don't think you could automate it because
No.
of what you're saying, and the new models supposedly would improve, but you might want to standardize the test procedure. In other words, here's
Mhm.
for an LLM like ChatGPT, you might have a specific set of prompts and then look at the output. The problem would be is if you're using different input, on a different release, how do you know, you don't have a relative sense of
Yep.
conformance. So we might want to have, where appropriate, we might want language that say, kind of appropriate use cases are used for this test or something. Or
It, Susanna, could I put you on the spot and just ask if this is making sense from a non, geek's perspective?
I think it, I think well, it's hard to say, right? I mean, you want to make it accessible to a broad variety of people. And I don't know if I can speak to that, but I think that, I mean, this do we anticipate that we would be testifying on this at all, on the contents of this report, or that we would have another opportunity to provide additional, explanation, or sort of like a simplified version to either any decision makers or members of the public if needed?
I think this is a good question. I guess I'm not expecting to testify on the content of the report. When I was testifying last year, was like, we have a code of ethics, and that was like how deep the conversation got to go.
Mhm.
That said, I do expect that the decision-making body on this is more likely to be like ADS issuing this as procurement guidance, like which we have autonomy to do.
Mhm.
So the decision makers are likely like Denise and Mark and myself that need to figure out how to operationalize this. Um, but I think that this concept, what I'm hearing is like there's two pieces. There's like a test for correctness, which can probably be automated or like have a standard set of prompts or data that you put in and you ensure you get the correct outputs. But then there's something that is more like an impact assessment that is also
Mhm.
required. Are we actually hitting the outcome endpoints that we wanted to?
Yep.
And I think,
I think that, yeah,
go ahead.
no, I think that does make sense. And I guess for me, I'm thinking, I mean, it's what's definitely one thing for us to know that process and that differentiation on the internally. And then there's how do we communicate that to the public? And then of course the question becomes, well, can we see those reviews? Can we see those assessments? And is there a protocol for whether and how that's discussed or shared, which is maybe outside the scope of what we're talking about immediately right now, but it just kind of comes to mind here.
Maybe those should be attached to the inventory. That might be a clean way to do it. Okay. So I like this kind of approach. Maybe Susanna, maybe you and I can each like take a run at drafting some of these standard questions for human review and bring those back to the
Yeah.
group at the next one.
Yes.
And if anyone else has ideas, feel free to drop them in as well. Yeah. Okay. So back to the batch versus regular workflow. If we were to say that it seems like these correctness tests probably happen whenever the model changes, and this impact assessment type test happens like on a regular cadence, like on an annual
Yeah.
cadence or something like that.
Yeah, that's how my mind constructed it.
Okay. So is that different between the batch and the regular workflow? Or does that cadence of model changing in an annual review pretty much cover it?
I think it'd probably be the same.
Okay.
My humble opinion.
Are we okay then if I get rid of that distinction? Or should I mention that we're treating them both the same way?
I would keep them separate because I think I don't know. I would keep them separate because I have a feeling that's going to come into play in some fashion because I'm just seeing that in descriptive terms when I, around the industry, as it were, right?
Okay.
It's okay that they have the same data.
Okay. Under this prompt of operated continuously or used under specific circumstances, we've talked about test suites. We've talked about the difference between batch and a regular operations type of model. We've talked about the requirement for review when the base model changes. I don't know if we end up needing this. Nope, I don't think that's relevant. Is there anything else we should talk about under that point?
That was point A.
It was B in the statute. I didn't renumber this yet. This is I'll clean up the formatting later.
I had a question that I think was in that section.
Yeah.
It's like with GDPR in Europe, people have the right to know what data is being used by these models, and even in GDPR, the right to be excluded, the right to be forgotten. Are we going that far? I mean, I think the public may want to know exactly what kind of data is going in of theirs, the personal data. Do we want to speak to that? Like,
I was gonna talk about that down in procurement standards, and we can jump down here now. So we had said we want to address procurement standards, and then we hadn't really like fleshed out what that looked like. So as I was prepping for this session, I was thinking that a reasonable approach to take right now, because there is still so much kind of variability in this space. It's still an immature space. Focusing on the documentation that we want provided and using that to inject our opinions about how systems ought to be. I was thinking that might be a reasonable approach. So there were 5, based on previous discussions, 5 things that I thought we may want to consider asking for when a vendor is bringing in an AI solution or has an AI solution as part of the system that they're offering us. One is a description of the system. Second one is the data use protocol. The third one is the release testing and monitoring plan, which I think we just had some great discussion on. The fourth is like some sort of defect reporting. And then the fifth is like, yes, I'll comply with, and then the list of guidelines or and the code of ethics that they will be complying with. If there are other there are other approaches to procurement standards and how to do that, and I those of you who work with me regularly know creating reams of paperwork is not something I love doing, but this feels like a flexible way to approach this for today that we can dial in later. But I'm interested in thoughts on if there's other approaches that we want to take, or if this is the right approach. Are these the right types of things to be asking for?
I think I understand what you're saying about the procurement thing. Would that include? Can you just help me a little bit on that point? Is that so? When we procure something, we would ask the vendor to say this uses name, address, whatever the data is, and that the public would have access to that, would be able to say, what of my data is in this model, not specific data, but what you just said. Would that be part of the procurement process? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that was my thought, is if we required this kind of data use protocol as a standard piece of documentation, we could attach that to the inventory.
That makes sense. And the public would be able to request to see it?
Yeah, well, we publish the inventory on an annual basis, so they would get that when the inventory came through.
I think that's perfect.
This doesn't cover the right to be forgotten. There is data privacy legislation that is being worked right now. Yeah, so I think we probably shouldn't wade into the right to be forgotten in this document.
I agree. I think that that's been unenforceable because
Yeah.
a technical standpoint, as you know, that backing data out is not as simple as it sounds.
No.
I agree with that.
Okay. Mark, you've been in the procurement game longer than I have. What do you think of this approach?
I like it, actually. Yeah, and they just become NF non-functional requirements in our catalog, so they fit smoothly with our process.
Yep. And my thought was that as
Is
we
there?
go ahead, Susanna.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, my thought was as we develop more opinions about what data use ought to look like, what release testing and monitoring ought to look like, the approach we've taken in other places in ADS is we start saying, no, now you're going to use our paper, right? And we provide a template, which kind of enforces it a little bit more and allows us to put more opinions in without like changing the policy framework. That's all.
My only, and I don't, Susanna, if you had thought that you were still gonna try to get out, I'll wait.
No, go for it.
Okay, so the only thing that's in my mind kind of getting a little squirrely is I think we've got a good handle on describing what we're trying to surface about the AI and the tools and the procurement and all that. But the data use and data privacy and data policy, those are all very separate, and those are really independent of whether it's an AI system or not for us in most cases, right? So are we basically, shouldn't we just basically expect to plug into whatever the data use policy is that's being developed and not have to restate it?
Maybe. I think there are specific things about algorithmic decision making that are a little different. And I know we've been using AI. I think we're constrained to automated decision making systems, which I think the statute defines as algorithms. So I think it's a little different. Like data inputs and outputs is a little bit of a different twist, I think, than say VAMIS or some of the more kind of pedestrian data management systems. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does from a nerd's perspective, but I think when like we started out talking about this as, we're talking about GDPR, right? And the way GDPR treats the data is the data, whether it's being used by an AI system or a non-AI system, right? And we're just basically having to do things precautionarily with AI because it can do things on its own to make sure that it doesn't overstep, but it's not a different data policy. So that's really what I was thinking. And really, I think what we're thinking about is there's data that's contributed to the system and it's resident. Then there's data that's derived from that data as part of workflow building, AI, just machine learning, decision making, whatever, right? So I don't know. That I was really not throwing that out there with a good idea, just throwing it out there as that's the part that doesn't sit yet.
I don't know if the chairs are interested in seeing if there's input, but I don't know if Chris Curtis is on or Michelle, if they have opinions, if the chairs want to recognize Michelle on this one.
Michelle was here.
I'm here.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi. I'm recovering from a dental assault, so my smile is straight. What? Can you repeat your question?
Yes, sorry. So I guess Mark was talking about how this idea of data use protocol, we want to be very careful with it to make sure we're not overlapping or making things more complicated than they need to be relative to the other data requirements that are attached to procurements that are already going on in the state. And I know there was some work happening on data specific requirements for procurements. And I wasn't sure if you wanted to weigh in on any of that and how these things might overlap.
So we didn't used to have a lot of data requirements in normal contracts. It was only really in ones we considered to be IT. And that's changed because we realized data is involved in so many different types of contracts. So attachment C, which is our standard terms and conditions, now will have a data use and kind of privacy and basic security requirements for every single contract and grant that goes through. Then we'll be layering that with attachment D, which we use. It's a IT attachment D, and it has more specific IT terms. We'll probably be adding some to that. So I guess to say those things will be addressed in our contracts for sure. We're kind of trying to look ahead to AI and see like how that might impact these clauses. And I think one way is the data use. Like a lot of companies now are asking us like, well, we want to use the data for other things too. We won't violate anybody's privacy, but we want to run algorithms or use it for different things. And that's something we're trying to really get our arms around and clamp down on to at least make sure it's a permissible use. We understand what's happening with the data, making them disclose all uses that they want to make of the data. So that's where we're kind of going in the procurement world. I don't know how that would impact the legislation that's, going on with data privacy. I kind of see that as separate. We wouldn't, obviously, if there's legislation on it, that's got to be baked into our contracts after the fact, but.
Okay.
Does that answer it all?
I think that's helpful framing. So I guess, Mark, back over to you. Do you have any ideas yet, or should I just in general keep this section pretty broad?
I would, for the purposes of the report, say that what we're doing is basically going to be aligning to the data privacy legislation as it comes out. We're preparing the inventory to, track and divulge of our systems, those things that we'll need to do that. And we're working with the Attorney General's office to bake in these data policy and privacy concerns within all of our contracts.
I like that.
Okay. Getting back to John's point from earlier, we want to make sure that we are getting this information about AI systems. I guess maybe this is another Michelle question. Are we usually attachment C and D, as far as I know them, we tend to just be like thou shalt and thou shalt not, but not be requiring specific information back from the vendor about here's what we're doing. So I guess are we expecting the vendor to provide information about here's what we're doing with the data, or is it still worth asking for that type of explanation?
I think we will ask in the procurement process, maybe in the RFPs and the negotiation stage. We are going in as you can't use our data for anything other than the purposes of performing this contract. That's the going in standard. If they want to do something else, then I think that's where we would start to say, what do you want to do with it? Is there a question? Go ahead.
No, finish your thought. I think it's a good thought.
Yeah. Then what are you going to do with it, and try to have an understanding of that and make sure that it's a bargain for exchange as well. Sometimes what are they getting from this contract? They're getting a lot more than we thought.
Good point. In other words, they're benefiting from learning on the inhabitants of Vermont.
Yeah, it could be. And maybe that's okay, but maybe not. Or more and more we're getting concerned that they're going to use it for targeted marketing. They'll sell it to someone. We just want to make sure that the going in is you can't use it. And if you're going to use it, tell us how and why.
That's great. And I think we may also, what I was going to say is around security. I know there was a security and privacy element in here, but what safeguards they have on the information leaking out, or I don't know. I mean, this is kind of wonky, but do you all know the concept of differential privacy?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I don't know if everyone does. Yeah, go ahead and give
The
us the
idea
dollar.
is that you might have information that says, I'll never reveal the income of a person by address. But if you have multiple data sources that have that stuff, the AI can relate those things and unintentionally expose something that was intended not to be ever put together. And I think the idea of how getting them to say how they not only that they can't use the data without for any other purpose without explicit permission, we also would need to understand what privacy security security and privacy things that they build in and how they test it. I know that was sprinkled through the document, but I think that we would want them to make a strong statement of on privacy, security. I don't know where that goes, but
yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah,
I'll put a note in here. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, that's I appreciate this conversation because that's what I was going to say earlier. I would be I think that in our group we may have an understanding of what we intend or what our vision is. Or maybe when we defer a topic, we know that we're going to come back to it. But I think it would be good to put that in the report. Hey, we're aware of issues like right to be forgotten or something like that. We acknowledge that needs further consideration, and so we're not ignoring it, but we're not going to resolve anything or declare anything in this report. So if there's a place where we can put those sidebar, well, I know we already kind of have where we're doing some sidebar stuff, but I guess what I'm saying is I would, for some of these issues that we still have open questions on, I would rather us explicitly name them and just say they're still open questions rather than not include them here, because I do think that it holds us accountable and it holds the rest of the state accountable as well to come back to those. And so, and I have a limited understanding of differential privacy. My sort of work around that was mainly around the census and the ways in which it was distorting the ethnic and racial category in places that have really small jurisdictions like Vermont and Alaska. So it's something that I have, with my limited understanding, I generally really don't like it, at least the way that it's applied in the census situation. So for whatever that's worth, I think that if we're able to put a mention in there about the various ways in which that can either create harm or distort our other data gathering needs, then that could be a good thing to mention.
I like that.
Question maybe for the group. One of the things that we had talked about at the beginning of this data use conversation was the idea that we'd want to have like plain English answers to what are the things you're taking in, what are you mixing it with that's coming from other places, and what are you putting out. We wanted like plain English version of that we could attach to the AI inventory. And if we're going to instead attach that to all IT or maybe even all contracts, I think that that's fine. Is it important to have that kind of plain English version of that information as a thing that we can make publicly as a matter of routine course? That, in other words, that's not buried in a stack of contract language.
I think the only answer is yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's where I was going. So I guess with, I wanted to confirm that was true. So with that, Michelle, can we make sure that if we're going to rely on attachments C and D to kind of collect this about all IT systems, that we maybe require that to be a separate exhibit or something so that we have that kind of plain language thing that we can expose to the public.
Would that need to be in the contract itself, or would that be something we could put like OPC website or something like that to explain kind of our process or our philosophy and approach? I wouldn't really want it in the contract.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, if this is part of the contract vehicle, how do we make sure we get something in English back that we can show to the public? Or is there another vehicle, like maybe the OPC website, where we collect these things and store them on a regular basis?
I think that would be the way, even we have public facing websites that list all our contracts and things. So maybe that could be part of that. If people want to know about state contracting and how we're handling these situations, they could look at it there. It's just a thought. I don't know if that's the best place, but that might work.
Okay, I'll take a stab at this and circulate it, and we can discuss it more at the next one. In the interest of time, I think I'll keep rolling, and I want me to keep rolling.
Roll on, roller.
All right. Let's see. The description of the system we've already talked about a bit under explainability, so that's more memorializing that conversation as a deliverable. What about these release testing and monitoring plan, defect reporting, and a certification of compliance? Thoughts on those, or what should be included in them? And I'll let you read the notes I have on the screen. I won't read them, but you can see them. And what else should be added? Do you want any changes to these? Should we have like more standard documentation added, or can any of these be taken away?
I'd only repeat my question about the testing is that from a practical standpoint, that anyone using one of these systems has to come up with a reasonable test, input with expected output, whatever you're expecting in terms of appropriateness, fairness, et cetera, and that test data needs to be, evaluated and modified as the features, so I think saying that my thinking is you don't want to have an ad hoc, you test it one generation, somebody else tests it the next generation, and it's just a matter of personal preference. That I think a standard set of scenarios that you would present at each version and then review the results for appropriateness makes more sense. So I don't know what you would say. It's that their each usage is required to have a some sort of test suite.
Yeah, like some form of regression testing, almost like
That
where.
was what that was the wonky.
Yeah, like
I was trying to avoid that word, but yeah.
I know I can't avoid nerd words sometimes, though.
But I think it was some sort of ability to test fairly between versions.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be automated. I think these systems are too hard to automate the testing. It's not like, add these numbers and get the right thing. But in terms of bias, in terms of tone, if it's text and stuff like that, a human needs to be in the loop to evaluate it. But you would want to present it with basically similar inputs and look at the outputs, which you hope would get better at each level. But at each level, there's an opportunity to insert bias, for example. By accident. Yep. You hope by accident.
Something scripted, but yes, for sure. Scripted in terms of like, this is the script we follow, not.
Yeah, not a language script, right? Some procedure for testing.
Yeah.
Test data and review. Some sort of. I don't want to make work for people, but I think.
Well, and I think that's a good idea because I think there's a lot of those that are starting to come out from different organizations. Like these are the kinds of things that you can do now to kind of test your AI for. I mean, they're not going to certify it as bias free, but these are the kinds of things they say where bias does pop up when you do these kinds of things. And I think your what was the word you used before? You and Susanna,
Differential privacy.
Yeah,
Privacy.
like things that can highlight those types of situations, right?
Great point. What about so imagining that let's see, a system like an identity proofing system that uses AI in order to figure out how whether someone is who they say they are. It asks you some questions, and if you are answering enough of them correctly, it's like, yeah, you're really Mark, and otherwise it says, no, you're not really Mark. Go away. Like a system like that uses AI, the test cases for that are going to tend to be sensitive. They're not going to want to expose those to us because it's part of their secret sauce. But I think it is worthwhile requiring that if their system starts failing their internal tests, that we get a notification of that in some way. I guess that's where my thoughts going. Like, even if they're not willing to expose their test protocols because it's part of their secret sauce, we should still be alerted when it starts failing their tests. Thoughts on that?
I like that. I guess what would we do about it?
Good question. I think it would impact how we use the system. So we've talked before about if a system starts behaving inappropriately, right? We might put in guardrails upstream of the system, put in additional checks downstream of the system. I think it would go into that workflow of like, it's now failing some sort of test. We know it's not behaving well for families over size 4 or children, adult children who are over 25 living with their parents or something like that. It's not working well in those cases. So now we have to put some sort of a manual review process in to ensure that we're accurately handling those cases. I think it's something like that.
Are we still talking about state contractors?
Yes.
So, and just a thought I had is, I mean, we're gonna make them trot this all out during the selection process, right? During the procurement process. We're gonna say, how do you do it? How do you test it? How does this work? How do you, we would have a really good description of those things. And this would help us make the criteria, what do we want to ask for? What kind of a system and what criteria? Maybe people who have really good testing protocols would get higher scores. We could evaluate them differently. So I could see a lot of ways we could use this and then of course bake it into the contract, but that's one of my thoughts.
Thanks. Okay. I guess I went into defect reporting at the same time, so we can come back. I'll work on fleshing these out. I know we are getting pretty close to time. I am thinking that it's probably worthwhile to have one more of these meetings in December to work through this. I know we didn't end up doing our in-person meeting in November as we had hoped to, but maybe doing one more remote session in December. If Susanna and Mark, are you open to doing that?
Heck yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And then we'll have
Yeah.
one, at least one, I think it's January like 4th or something, is our usually scheduled one. So looking at the calendar, do we want to like target the 15th? Do we want to try to do something like the 8th? What are people thinking? Or is there a better day?
I think the 22nd is a bad idea, so let's try the 15th. Is my just thrown out suggestion.
Okay.
If
Any
we
other
did
discussion? Go ahead.
If we did the 15th, I could probably do, we're saying our normal time block?
Yeah, that's what I was going to do just for the sake of making it easier.
I can do that.
Okay. All right, I will send an invite. I'll probably reschedule this one so that it goes to all the right people and the external link still works. Okay. Susanna, do you want to go to the public comment period, or is there anything else we want to cover before that?
If no one has anything else, then yes, all right. Those of you on the call who are not working group members and who would like to address the council, please feel free to do so. We'll be watching the chat if you'd rather do that in writing, or if you'd like to come off mute and share your thoughts, please go ahead now. Thanks, Matthew. We're seeing your comment in the chat, and we've appreciated you being active in the convo along the way. All right, I'm not seeing any takers. Perhaps someone's just typing something very long. If that's the case, please still go ahead and send it. We can have access to the chat during and after the meeting. There's also a website for this council on the state's websites as well, if you'd like to poke around later on. But I think that concludes public comment for today.
All right. Do we have a motion to adjourn then?
I will make the motion to for us to adjourn.
I'll second. I think we lost a couple members. So I don't know if there's anyone left to second.
All right. I guess then we can say thanks, everybody.
All in favor?
All in favor? Aye. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Have
Bye.
a good
All right,
weekend.
thank you.
Bye.